Welcome to the Baumer Lecture Series. I'm sure all of you know Todd Gannon as a distinguished professor of architecture. He was the former section head of the Knowlton School of Architecture section. But some of us have known Todd long before he was distinguished. Pretty much KB and I think. Yeah. He was a precocious and pesky teenager for a while there, and always working an angle. I was lucky enough to have Todd on 2 study abroad programs that I led to Italy during that period, but I can't even recount how much independent travel Todd did as a student. I recall that you guys had a project in Australia, and you needed some site research done, so they all put in like $100 and then had a lottery. And Todd lost. But he went as far as Los Angeles with the winner, and he brought his passport. And this was pre-9/11, so he took the ticket, got on the plane, and went to Australia. Todd knows how to make things happen, and I admire that about him. Todd got his BS in architecture and his M.Arch here at Ohio State University, and then went on west to Los Angeles to get a PhD at UCLA in architecture. Some phone is ringing.
It's yours.
Oh. Todd knows how to solve problems. Evidence for you there. While in California, Todd taught at UCLA and at SCI-Arc and really established himself as a major voice in the architectural conversations in Southern California, across the United States, and really across the world. He has lectured at institutions all over the place. He has served on board of directors of the AIA Ohio, the Los Angeles Forum of Architecture and Urban Design, and he has been honored by too many institutions to name, but I'll name a few. The Graham Foundation, the Getty Foundation, the National Endowment of the Arts, the American Institute of Architects, etc. Todd, the architect, and Todd, the critical thinker, is really one of the best products to emerge from the Knowlton School of Architecture. He's a rare mix of seemingly incompatible talents. He's a talented designer and a registered architect. He understands the theoretical aspects of form and the semiotics of sign, but he also understands material and construction. Todd is in the big idea, but Todd is in the detail too. Todd is in the details. Okay, we just did that in history class. If second year were here, they'd be chuckling. He's a provocative critic and an astute commenter on architecture as an instrument of culture writ large. Brilliant, inspiring teacher, he provokes his students to push beyond a mere understanding of architecture as a technical practice, and to try to use it as a tool to register and reflect upon larger issues in culture, issues in the world, issues in the environment, issues in just communication. Most surprisingly, especially for those of us who knew Todd as a pesky teenager, he proved to be a gifted and able administrator. His years as section head of architecture at the Knowlton School really represented a kind of golden age. His uncanny mixture of charm, wit, intelligence, vision, and genuine curiosity inspired a wonderful spirit of inclusion and collaboration. Never was the faculty so engaged, so happy, and productive. Under Todd's leadership, the faculty grew, and some of the brightest young people teaching here now were all brought here because of Todd's vision and Todd's ability to get things done. Getting a faculty line approved at this university is nothing short of magic, and Todd worked wonders in that area. Todd's writings are not merely prolific. Many writings that come out of architecture schools seem like they are aimed to feed the tenure machine. People just churn stuff out, and you wonder who will ever read this. But Todd's writings are actually interesting, and they touch on topics, important topics, in fresh new ways. His dissertation research on the architectural critic Reyner Banham really gave a fresh new look at one of the seminal giants of criticism of the 20th century. And in the field of architectural criticism and history, where prose styles twist and turn into things that barely resemble the English language, Todd's writings are refreshingly clear and transparent and lucid and focused. It's a joy to read him. You feel like you're having a conversation with a brilliant mind rather than struggling to get through a twisted text. He's astonishingly prolific. His new book, available here, Figments of the Architectural Imagination, is a wide-ranging collection of essays and only just published in 2022. His magnum opus so far is Reyner Banham and the Paradoxes of High Tech, which came out in 2017. In addition, he's written so many important essays and edited slews of books, and a number of the KSA source books, especially the early KSA source books, like the Light Architecture Reader and Morphosis and other ones. We at Knowlton are so lucky to have Todd back. We should do everything we can to keep him here and show him how we value his contributions, not only to our own school, but to the architectural community at large. He is a treasure. That's it.
Thank you, Jackie. This is on, right? Yeah. Thank you. I came to school here in 1993 or 2, in the 1900s. And I had not so long before failed out of a middle-tier East Coast institution. And I spent a year digging ditches, and I didn't like that very much. And I talked my way in here, and I met some really incredible teachers, people like Jackie, like Mike, like Doug Graff, Jane Murphy, José Oubrerie, Rob Livesey. It was really an incredible place. And so I spent some time here, I taught here, somehow along the way I figured out that architecture was shown to me by those great teachers to be just so much more than I ever thought it could be. And so anything that is of interest today really owes a huge amount to those great teachers. So I just want to thank all of you for everything you showed me. So I also want to thank tonight Jackie again for a lovely introduction. If you haven't gone on one of Jackie's Italy tours or Europe tours now, just go. They're amazing. You'll be really tired while you're there, but you'll be really happy you did it when you come back. So thank you for the introduction, Jackie. Thank you to Aman for putting everything together. And thank you, Netta, for bearing with me on this book sale thing. I hope it works out. We will have some books for sale at the end of the talk. So I hope you'll be moved to purchase one. So tonight I want to share a few excerpts from this new book, Figments of the Architectural Imagination. It's a collection of 20 essays that I've written over the last 20 years. My friend and colleague José wrote a fantastic introduction to it. And the book includes several essays written collaboratively with the literary critic Catherine Hales, with the philosopher Graham Harman, and with architects including David Rue, Tom Wiscombe, and Andrew Zago. Our own Ben Wilkie designed the book. I can't see where Ben is because I'm wearing my reading glasses, so I think he's here somewhere. But he did a really beautiful job, and Curtis Roth designed this fantastic cover. So for my money, the cover is really all you need. So just really quickly how the book came about. For longer than I'm willing to admit, I've been working on a book on the architect Frank Israel. Frank was a big player in the LA school in the 1990s, and he died prematurely at the age of 50 in 1996 of AIDS, right at the moment that his career was really taking off. And so I've been working on kind of getting Frank's story kind of packaged for posterity, I guess. And the research relies heavily on Frank's archival papers, which are kept at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. So when COVID hit, the Getty closed, and that made it basically impossible to work on the book. When things started to reopen in the summer of 2021, the Getty remained closed. And so I was getting sort of antsy, and I needed something to do, and I got the idea that I would put together this anthology. So that's what we did. It came together pretty quickly. It took Ben and I about a year. It took me about 6 months to get all the stuff together, and then it took Ben and I a little longer to put it together, and it just came out this past October. So still pretty new. I wanted you guys to, I told this joke a long time ago when but I got to number 2 on Amazon, and I couldn't knock the homework planner off the top spot. So at the time I was just like begging people to buy the book in hopes of getting to number 1. Now I'm in like 2 millionth place, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, I wanted to begin with this image, which was designed by our own Bart Overley. Is Bart here? But Bart made this image for a symposium that Jeff Kipnis organized at the Wexner Center in 2004. And that was for a symposium to celebrate the release of Peter Eisenman's then new and finally released book on Giuseppe Torragni. My book, this one, really wouldn't exist without this poster. And this maybe gives a little more of the kind of backstory. I lay this out a little bit more in detail in the preface, but for what are probably obvious reasons, Cynthia Davidson really wanted to run this poster in Log. Log had just started. Cynthia, of course, among the many other things that she is to the field, she is also married to Peter Eisenman. And she really liked this poster, and she needed a reason to put it in the book. So Bob Somel, who was teaching here at the time, put Cynthia in touch with me, and that led me to write a review of the symposium, which appeared in Log 2. And that really was my entree into the world of working with Cynthia at Log, where, however many years later, 20, I remain a protagonist, and where many of the texts that appear in this book first saw the light of day. And really, without that involvement with Log, and without Cynthia like beating me up enough to turn me into a passable writer, there would be no reason to do this book. So tonight I'd like to present a brief essay that first appeared in Log, and another one that ran in JAE a few years later. In between, I'll add a brief interlude that expands on some of the theory that underpins those essays. Now, normally I don't give lectures from a set script, but since part of the point of the book is the prose, I'm going to treat the talk tonight like a more traditional reading that you might get from a more traditional author. And I'll deliver each of the 3 pieces in a slightly different voice. In the first one, which I wrote roughly at the midpoint of my term as section head, I'll use what I'll call my official educator voice. And I'll use that to try to say something about the kind of teaching I find most valuable, the kind of teaching that I think this school has always been really known for at least the past 40 years. And also to lay out some of the theory that those educational values are built on. In the second part, I'll unpack some of that theory in the hopes that all of you can take it with you and use it for your own purposes. Now, I know that the juniors have a review on Friday, and I told Jackie, this will teach you how to do well on your review. But more broadly, if you use this for good or evil, I don't care. It's really up to you. So that second part won't be scripted at all, and that'll really come out in my more casual teacher voice, so you get a little taste of the classroom. And then the final part, which I wrote in 2017, has to do with the intersection of environmentalism and aesthetics. In that last piece, I'll use what I'll call my history theory voice, which is what probably most of the text in this book are written in. Now, these voices aren't that different. I mean, they're all mine. But you will, I think, notice certain shifts in tone, and those reflect the slightly different audiences that I was originally addressing when I wrote the books. And I hope that they all kind of like mush together in some way and give you a sense of my architect voice, which I think at the end of the day is where I'm writing from. I write as an architect, I think as an architect, and I really, were it not for the time I spent practicing and drawing details and walking around in the mud on construction sites, I don't think I could have written these essays in the way that I have, and honestly, I don't think I would have wanted to. So anyway, so that's just a little bit of background. Each of the 3 parts takes about 15 minutes, actually a little less, so say 40 to 45 minutes total to get to the finish line. And let's start with the page that I marked with that piece of paper that I have to now find again. Okay. Oh, so this first appeared in this issue of Log in 2020. And the current issue of Log is the catalog for the models exhibition that ran at the Cooper Union just this past fall. So those two issues, I think 50 and 57, kind of go together. So we'll start here. They appear just after Thanksgiving, around the time when everything in Columbus begins to fade to wintry gray. There are usually about 25 of them, squat, vaguely cubic, roughly milk crate sized, arranged in an alien phalanx on the big steps in Knowlton Hall, where Mack Scogin and Merrill Elam Architects designed the home of the Knowlton School at The Ohio State University. Easter egg colors predominate and starkly contrast the coolness of Mack and Merrill's concrete and the clouds gathering outside. The objects exhibit a curious density. Their masses are less solid than stuffed with squishy sleeves of space. Moving in for a closer look, notice that they appear to have been sliced from larger holes to reveal hints of building-like orthogonality. A stair here, a balcony there, the occasional stack of boxy rooms, nestled into otherwise plump, invaginated volumes. These are the final models of Knowlton's first semester, second-year graduate architecture studio, G2 for short. As it turns out, they represent hotel designs for an urban site in Cincinnati, but you'd be hard-pressed to figure that out on your own. The drawings pinned up nearby uniformly eschew labels, and the syllabus, assembled by instructors Eric Herman and Sanjay Kochar, and clotted with allusions to the work of philosophers like Graham Harman, Martin Heidegger, and Bruno Latour, art critics like Michael Fried and Dave Hickey, and mostly young architects, Atwood, Bonner, Lai, Meredith, Niemark, Sample. That syllabus speaks not of hotels, but rather, and rather cryptically, Eric, of a thing inside a thing inside a thing. Now each year the models trigger a wave of excitement that ripples through the school. And they don't really look like this anymore, but they still, I think, have that kind of power. On final review day, undergraduates who normally hang out on the steps gawk at the curious invaders that have commandeered their lunch spot. G2 students lean gregariously on one another with the air of post-competition athletes. G1s chatter nervously, wondering if they'll be able to pull it off next year. And flinty-eyed G3s look on in silence like war veterans. Studio reviews are uniformly lively and generate their share of criticism, some of which, the kind that whines like tinnitus at Ohio State, SCI-Arc, Penn, Pratt, UCLA, and other institutions where advanced formal speculation remains the norm, I'll use as a jumping-off point here. The criticism takes aim at the purportedly problematic relationship of speculative work to the realities of conventional building tectonics and functional performance. Critics, who it turns out are often the same students who made the models, are quick to point out that while interesting, these models tend to be long on form and short on function, underdeveloped in terms of structure and program, and in some cases improbable as buildings, raising thorny questions as to their ultimate value to the education of an architect. True enough. In this studio, we suspend some technical questions and encourage students to pursue compositional and spatial effects unperturbed by often stifling realities of structure, program, and budget. Now, of course, we take on those issues much more seriously in later studios. The comprehensive immediately follows this one. Beth Blowstein and I used to teach it. Fu and Ashley teach it now. So don't worry, we're still grown-ups. But we're more than grown-ups. Because if architecture is understood merely in the traditional and dictionary sense as the art and science of building, a case can be made that these models fall short. But if architecture is understood more broadly as an unfolding investigation into the possibilities of occupying material form, as our own Jeff Kipnis once put it, these models are right on the money. Now, to achieve this broader understanding of the discipline, we often encourage our students to proceed via counterintuitive experimentation and calculated risk-taking. In other words, we sometimes ask them to do things the wrong way on purpose. We do so not out of recklessness, but out of a desire to produce new forms of rightness. If all we asked were for our students to conform to best practices, you hear that stupid term all the time, all you would ever do is repeat known successes. If we want new successes, we need new practices. And that, in a milk crate, is what these models are about. If it ain't broke, break it. Now, a key difference between our position and that of our critics is that the latter generally want to close gaps they identify in the work, gaps between the models and the buildings they represent, between education and the professional practice it predicts, and even those pesky gaps between materials that signal poor craft in models and allow the rain into and the heat out of poorly made buildings. Though we agree that craft-related gaps should be eliminated, at Knowlton we usually aim to open gaps between models and buildings, schools and offices, theory and practice, discipline and profession, in order to demonstrate that the most interesting work in any field tends to emerge from the dissonance between the polarities by which those fields are defined. As I've argued elsewhere, a defining polarity in architecture is that between a profession understood as a technical pursuit and a discipline understood as an art form. By denying the assumption that an architect's job is to resolve the inherent misalignment of these aspects of architecture, we aim to teach our students how to exploit the inevitable gaps between them to generate new possibilities for the field. Now, that was a little dense, so this next bit will unpack it a little. All architecture is a function of a gap between concepts and actuality, as even the dullest project architect will confirm. You know who I'm talking about. That grouchy guy, it's always a guy, in every office who can't stop telling the interns to forget about that theory stuff they learned in school and face up to the real world. The next time you visit a building with that guy, point out a flaw. A misaligned light fixture, a badly finished wall surface, any punch list item will do. As if on cue, he will protest. He'll say something like, well, it's not supposed to be that way. In this, our rock-ribbed realist draws attention away from the supposedly real world of the building to an apparently realer one of its architecture. Now, we all do this. You'll do this at your review on Friday, juniors. You will put a drawing on the wall and you'll say, here's my drawing, it's really great. And a critic will say, maybe it's not so great. And you'll say, it's supposed to be. And in that move, you're moving it away from that physical thing on the wall toward some virtual set of intentions or concepts or possibilities that exist beyond that drawing on the wall. Architecture always lives in that kind of dialogue between the real and the virtual. The conceptual doppelganger that haunts all material form, what Rosalind Krauss once labeled the hermeneutic phantom, is not an irrelevant example of obscure theorizing, as our hapless PA might have it, but it's a precise description of his favorite excuse for slipshod construction. And though he might not believe it, his protestations make clear that he at least intuitively understands that architecture cannot be reduced to buildings. Rather, architecture must be understood in terms of the persistent gap between material form and immaterial concepts. Now, in my drawing attention to gaps, readers may notice an echo of Graham Harman, whose book on H.P. Lovecraft centers on the philosophical implications of the production and destruction of gaps. Less obvious, but perhaps more important to my argument, is the debt I owe to the late sociologist Murray S. Davis. In an influential 1971 essay, Davis points to the importance of denying expectations of one's audience in order to produce interesting social theories. Here, theories have to do primarily with the relationship between what seems to be and what is. That is, in its most basic form, a theory states whether phenomenology aligns with or diverges from ontology. Whether a theory is found to be interesting, by contrast, has more to do with the audience and occurs when a prevailing assumption about the relationship between seeming and being is denied. Most theories, like the common sense into which successful ones degrade, work to eliminate gaps to make the world more manageable, understandable, and predictable. Here are a couple. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Humans evolved from apes. E equals MC squared. Interesting theories, on the other hand, in Davis's words, constitute an attack on the taken-for-granted world and always upset prevailing assumptions. Humans evolved from apes? Mass is equivalent to energy? Of course, interest is always context-dependent. However shocking these once were, Darwin's theories of evolution and Einstein's theory of special relativity have, for most of us, long since slouched into the comforting familiarity of common sense. Now, Davis's formula for interesting social theory is simple and is easily transported to other fields, and here it is. What is accepted as X is actually non-X. Importantly, Davis is careful to point out that theories need not be true to be interesting. His opening lines ought to be tattooed on the inner forearm of every aspiring theorist and PhD student working today. And they are. It has long been thought that a theorist is considered great because his theories are true, but this is false. A theorist is considered great not because his theories are true, but because they are interesting. In fact, theories that merely verify prevailing assumptions are generally dismissed as their truth is affirmed. That's obvious, we huff and move along. Now, as responsible professionals, we are professionals after all, architects often and rightly work to eliminate gaps by aligning phenomenology with ontology. That column right there seems sufficiently strong to carry the load that's placed upon it, and it turns out it is sufficiently strong. That window over there seems to be the right size to provide light and air to the room, and in fact it is the right size. Useful buildings often result from the application of such common sense thinking. Interesting architecture requires more. Interesting architecture, which is to say architecture, most often results when architects deny prevailing assumptions. Henri Lebrouste understood as much when he specified columns that appear insufficiently strong to carry the vaults they support in the reading room of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Colin Rowe knew it too when he quipped, "If you see a building with windows of a size to admit an appropriate amount of light, it may or may not be a work of architecture. But if the windows are definitely too big or definitely too small, then you can be almost certain that you are in the presence of an architectural endeavor." The implication is startling. Adherence to convention only sometimes leads to architecture. Affronts to convention nearly always do. And here we need the footnote. The footnote is really small. It goes, if architecture exists as an affront to building, it also sometimes finds itself at odds with theory, which too often is expected to serve as a model for practice. Normally, architectural theories become interesting when individual buildings conform to a theory's general principles. Individual buildings, on the other hand, become interesting when they confound theory's necessary generalizations. For proof, compare the built work of any architect who has written a theory to the general principles of that theory. You will find that work is most interesting when the gap between the architecture and the theory is the most profound. Given this, we should return to understanding and teaching building as a cause for and not as an effect of theory, at least until that approach ceases to be interesting. Now, these G2 models should be understood in the same spirit. If you see a model with interior spaces appropriate to their intended uses, it may or may not be a work of architecture. But if you see work in the junior review on Wednesday or Friday with interior spaces that wildly exceed what is appropriate for their intended uses, you can be almost certain that you are in the presence of an architectural endeavor. I allow that some, but not all, of these models are implausible as buildings. I also submit that most, if not all of them, point to exciting new possibilities for architecture. In this, our students take up the challenge Mack and Merrill posed to them with Knowlton Hall, which we often hold up as a model for speculative practice around here. Our building, with its undulating curves, odd shingles, and crystalline voids chiseled into its marble mass, flies in the face of its staid, brick-clad context to open a yawning chasm between what it is and what campus buildings are expected to be. Where most buildings at Ohio State offer bland stacks of single-height classrooms clipped to double-loaded corridors, Mack and Merrill conjure an architecture of dizzying volumetric complexity. Triple and even quadruple height spaces soar up past faculty offices, through design studios, and around glass-clad laboratories that cling to the ceiling like wayward balloons. Outlandishly long ramps guide visitors up through a section torn open by split-level floors, pinned in place by concrete columns. Resisting the regimentation of an orthogonal grid, these columns are distributed loosely across the plan and scaled like oaks. On entry, first-time visitors typically raise their eyes skyward and fall reverentially silent. Only after they've collected themselves do they begin to scratch their heads and wonder how the hell they're supposed to find the lecture hall. Don't worry, just head up the ramp. You all went through it. We all found our way here. Once occupants have spent a little time figuring the place out, new possibilities begin to emerge. Curious nooks offer cozy spots to cram for a quiz or sneak in a nap. Gaps between floor levels provide more than just spatial excitement. They foster casual communication between normally isolated floors, with students exchanging tips and gossip and occasionally lobbing snacks across the void. Where most buildings segregate occupants into clearly defined rooms, this one joins them in loosely layered overlapping zones. The G2 models attempt something similar. Though they may not yet exhibit professional control to the degree that is everywhere apparent in this building, they signal a commitment to speculative possibility that is utterly lacking in far too many buildings today. Reliance on conventional methods and best practices alone, which manage expectation by foreclosing uncertainty, quite simply cannot produce possibilities like these. Indeed, the more we adhere to them, the less likely we are to produce architecture at all. So that ends part one. So far, so good? Everybody's with me? Okay, for the second part, I want to unpack this essay by Murray Davis. I don't know how I found this. Yeah, I do. But I'll tell that story another time. But I came across this essay. Davis was not someone who I read a lot of. I've read plenty since. But the essay really seemed to kind of clarify a lot of the questions that seem to come up again and again in studios. And so what I did with this series of diagrams that I'll show you now is just kind of take that essay, which is really long and pretty dense, and all of its examples come from sociological theory from the early 1970s and late 1960s. So like, it'll bore the hell out of all of you. So I have made it palatable. It's actually a really interesting essay, but it can be a little slow going, I think, particularly for denizens of our millennium. So this is how it works. So we'll start with this quote from Colin Rowe. So again, it's such a good quote. If you see a building with windows of a size to admit an appropriate amount of light, it may or may not be a work of architecture. But if the windows are definitely too big or definitely too small, then you can be almost certain that you are in the presence of an architectural endeavor. Now, we're not asking whether that's true. We're asking whether that's interesting. I submit that it is. And it has to do with Davis's definition of what a theory is. And for Davis, a theory is a proposition about the relationship between what seems to be, or phenomenology, and what is, ontology. An interesting theory, on the other hand, denies a prevailing assumption about that relationship. Now here's a boring proposition. What you see is what you get. Phenomenology equals ontology. We need to do this a lot, as I said in the text. Like sometimes verifying hunches or confirming suspicions is important work. It's akin to what Thomas Kuhn called regular science. But an interesting proposition tells us that there's more to something than meets the eye. We haven't quite settled this question. And we've noticed that there's a gap between phenomenology and ontology. Now, those of you who have been in my theory classes, you know that I argue strenuously that there's always a gap. We can never get the two things to line up. They will never, ever line up. We can talk about that another time. It takes a while. Take my word for it for now. But in that misalignment of seeming and being is where the interesting stuff happens. And here's how it works. So we live in a world made of things. Here's a thing. And here's us. And we're ambling around the world and we run into a thing. We're like, hey, this looks like a book. It is a book. That's boring. It's chocolate. More interesting. Even more interesting if it weren't chocolate and I ate it anyway. In any event, we run into objects and we make assumptions about what those objects are, what they do, why they matter, etc. Everything's fine until along comes a theorist. And the theorist has the job of having different assumptions. And the theorist also has the job, particularly if you're working as a teacher or if you're working, I guess like a theory busker who's just doing theory on the streets. You need to figure out a way to turn us into an audience, right? And so you do this by offering a theory. You think that's just a book. Let me tell you what that actually is. That is a demonstration of the international web of global capital in the publishing industry, all that stuff. That'd be a kind of boring theory, but it would be a theory. And as Davis shows us, the easiest way to produce an interesting theory is to simply say, you think it's this, it's actually something else. It doesn't actually matter what that something else. They're not all going to work, but this is a good mode to start. And if you pull it off, your audience will say, that's interesting. Seems simple, but not so fast. There are 3 ways to fail that Davis outlines in his book. 3. The first is to verify an existing assumption. If everybody thinks this is a book, and I write a big essay to demonstrate that you're all right, it is in fact a book, that is not going to be a particularly interesting essay. It might be a true essay, but it won't be interesting, and it's generally going to result in your audience saying, that's obvious. When Jackie talked earlier in the introduction about how a lot of scholarship seems to feel like it's just feeding the kind of publication industry, there's a lot of the scholarship kind of operates like that. Now again, particularly in the sciences, that sort of scholarship is important. We need to be able to kind of verify stuff. But for architecture, we're in the business of inventing new stuff. And if we keep confirming old stuff, it's not going to be interesting and therefore not going to be very good. So here's an example of that. These windows are the wrong size. What kind of result are we going to get? Yeah, no shit. We know they're the wrong size. We haven't told you anything interesting. Nothing has happened. Now, another way to fail is to fail to address an existing assumption. Architectural theorists do this all the time. We start speaking theory. And our audience tends not even to be able to read the alphabet, unless some of you can read Greek, but that's what it sounds like to a lot of people. And the result is that's irrelevant, or at least it's irrelevant to me. And here's an example of that. These are postmodern windows. Also true. Who cares? Until someone has given you a reason to care. Somebody like Jackie, or Iman, or Benji, or another history teacher that you might have. This is somebody that can kind of give you a reason to care about categories like modern and postmodern. This kind of categorization is going to be meaningless. It's not going to be interesting to your audience. A third way to fail, according to Davis, is to what he calls denying an entire assumption ground. Now, I think my math is okay there, but the kind of negating everything. You're generally going to say that's absurd. You say something, everything you think you know about Windows is wrong. You're nuts. It's too much, right? You have to deny a relevant assumption. That'll be found interesting. And that, I think, is what Colin Rowe does in this. He finds that sweet spot between what we know and what we don't know, between what seems to be and what is, and he exploits it. Now, there's another question that Davis takes up, and this is a problem that particularly architects who spend a lot of time teaching and then a lot of time practicing run into. How do you have broad appeal? Now, when we're out in the world talking to our clients, we can kind of use Davis's formula pretty easily, right? And when we're in school talking to each other, we can use Davis's theory pretty easily. But when we have an audience of both our colleagues, who we consider experts, and our clients, who are amateurs, we have a bit of a problem on our hands, right? So if we go to our clients and they assume that my kitchen is supposed to be this way, and I design a super cool kitchen that is a completely different way, they're like, oh, that's interesting, let's do that. And they sign the contract, you got a job. Your colleagues aren't going to find that very interesting because they do the same thing. They already know that trick. Right? So they're not going to be, they might like want to study your style or whatever, but it's not the same thing. If you want to be interesting to your colleagues, you've got to do something else. And so their assumption is already non-X. So you've got to negate an already a negative, and then so the theory equals not non-X, which we know equals X. This is what happens when you go home at Thanksgiving and you explain your project to your parents over Thanksgiving dinner. And you think it's like this amazing thing that you've been working on at school, and you're like, I'm doing this thing, and it has this concept, and your parents are like, well, yeah, it looks weird, and I assumed you go to architecture school and make weird stuff, and there it is, weird. It doesn't do anything for them because they already assume it's going to be weird, and so somehow we have a tendency to cancel out amateur interest when we talk amongst our expert colleagues. So what do? So here's the problem. We have the theorists, we have the broad audience, which has differing assumptions. They've got amateur assumptions, which we'll call X, expert assumptions that we'll call not X, and we need to come up with a theory. Davis gives us a two-part solution. Step one, demonstrate that X and not X actually equal Y. Join those expert and amateur opinions. Once you've joined them, offer a contrasting theory. So you got to do the work, you got to do a little bit more work. It was never about the windows. The architecture here has everything to do with that very strange door. So I submit, if you just keep this diagram in your head and think about the way you're constructing your arguments, whether you're going to go and talk to a client, whether you're going to go to your review on Friday, whether you're assembling your tenure documents, think about what your audience expects, what you're going to give them, and how you can manipulate those expectations, or manipulate what you're going to deliver in the face of those expectations to produce something that is interesting. So I hope that that helps. Now I got to switch. So that's the end of part 2. This is part 3. So we're almost done. Don't worry. This part's pretty short. Okay, so this is called strange loops. Beautiful things act like small tears in the surface of the world that pull us through to some vaster space. We find that we're standing in a different relationship to the world than we were a moment before. It's not that we cease to stand at the center of the world because we never stood there. It's that we cease to stand even at the center of our own world. We willingly cede our ground to the thing that stands before us. That's a quote from Elaine Scarry. In his famous 1965 essay, A Home is Not a House, Reyner Banham argued for a shift away from traditional built form toward technologically assisted environmental performance. To make his case, he identified a fork in the road of architecture's prehistory. Man, he states, started with 2 basic ways of controlling environment. One, by avoiding the issue and hiding under a rock, tree, tent, or roof. This led ultimately to architecture as we know it. And the other by actually interfering with the local meteorology, usually by means of a campfire, which in a more polished form might lead to the kind of situation now under discussion. With a half a century's hindsight, Banham's partitioning proves less tidy than he made it seem. the tradition of hiding under a rock produces plenty of interference with the local and global meteorology, which we now track in terms of resource depletion, carbon footprints, heat islands, and other deleterious effects. At the same time, the technological means with which we interfere tend to produce their own forms of monumentality, as Francois Delagre's exquisite drawings that accompanied Banham's essay made clear. Banham structured some of his most well-known arguments as duels between competing ideologies, such as aesthetics and ethics, tradition and technology, and style and performance. While he sometimes displayed a clear preference for the latter terms, more often he worked to uncover hints of other architectures that had less to do with abandoning one side for the other than with accounting for the paradoxical co-presence of contradictory ambitions in the built environment. Though Banham's search for alternatives was cut short by his untimely death in 1988, inventing other architectures that more nimbly negotiate the relationship between what we build, where we build it, and how we occupy it remains a pressing concern. As we become increasingly aware of humankind's culpability in the irreversible ecological effects associated with the Anthropocene, so too does considering our impact not only on our own probable futures, but also on those of the myriad animal, vegetable, mineral, and other non-human entities affected by our actions. Promising lines of thought will resist the easy partitioning of issues into dire choices, like people versus planet, complacency versus action, oblivion versus salvation. Instead, we'll acknowledge that the options outlined in such showdowns, like those in Banham's binaries, tend to curl back on themselves in complex feedback loops through which environments and their inhabitants co-construct one another. In these loops, oppositions do not finally settle into fixed hierarchies or resolve into dialectical syntheses. Rather, they reveal the imbrication of certainty and doubt, cause and effect, and beauty and justice in the uncanny coexistence of the human us and the non-human other. Such loops course through Dark Ecology, Tim Morton's 2016 text, in which he makes a case for a new kind of ecological awareness. Though the effects of positive and negative feedback loops are well known, Morton emphasizes the importance of strange loops, paradoxical structures that, like M.C. Esser's drawings, confound our understanding of the hierarchies that organize them. He offers the simple act of starting a car as an example. So here's Tim. Every time I start my car, I don't mean to harm Earth, let alone cause the 6th mass extinction event in the 4.5 billion year history of our planet. Furthermore, I'm not harming Earth. My key turning is statistically meaningless. But go up a level and something very strange happens. When I scale up these actions to include billions of key turnings, harm to Earth is precisely what is happening. I am responsible, as a member of this species, for the Anthropocene. So, at varying scales of observation, our everyday actions prove both innocent and apocalyptic. Too often, pundits in the climate wars acknowledge just one metric and argue with half-truths. Yet, strictly speaking, the skeptics are correct. Individuals and small groups exact a negligible toll on the environment. Of course, the environmentalists are also correct. The human species causes undeniable damage to the planet. Unfortunately, neither side knows where to draw the line between innocence and culpability. Definitive answers to the most difficult questions elude us, so round and round it goes. Everybody's right, nobody wins. In Dark Ecology, Morton attempts to break the logjam. Key to his argument is accepting that ecological awareness is weird. Etymologically, the term implies both looped structures and more familiar associations with the alien and strange. Rather than work to domesticate the world's weirdness by aligning phenomenology and ontology, as Western thinking usually does, Morton exalts it. He revels in paradoxes. You are both individual and species, both part of the problem and not, encountered everywhere in ecological debates. He does so not to resolve contradictions, but rather by showing that uncanny actions and paradoxical coexistences are less exception than the rule, to outline a future at one with the mystery and magic he finds throughout our world. Mourton draws heavily on the philosophical movement of object-oriented ontology, or O, in which he is a major voice and devotes a significant amount of attention to the problem of causality. A succinct gloss concludes with a crucial claim. So here's Tim again. Object-oriented ontology holds that things exist in a profoundly withdrawn way. They cannot be splayed open and totally grasped by anything whatsoever, including themselves. You can't know a thing fully by thinking it, or by eating it, or by measuring it, or by painting it. This means that the way things affect one another, causality, cannot be direct or mechanical, but rather is indirect and vicarious. Causality is aesthetic. Now, at first blush, Mourton's claims may seem counterintuitive. Termites chomped on a wood beam and caused it to collapse. Case closed. O doesn't see it so simply. Graham Harman, generally regarded as the movement's founder, builds on the thought of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger to understand the world in terms of what he calls sensual objects, which, following Husserl, are available to our consciousness, and real objects, which, following Heidegger, cannot be known. For O, the most salient distinctions are not between subjects and objects, as in most Western philosophy, but rather between autonomous entities, real but impossible to know, and relational ones, sensual and available to our consciousness. Now, Graham's quadruple object is probably the best. I think he's written a kind of even more straightforward starter kit book if you're interested in these ideas. But for now, just trust me. So hopefully this will clarify it a little bit. Think again about those termites. I'm willing to bet you know next to nothing about them and not much more about the wood they chomped. Even expert entomologists and dendrologists are only capable of perceiving a tiny sliver of the roiling complexities we reductively label termites and wood. That sliver resides entirely in Harman's sensual realm. In the parlance of O, the real termites and the real wood are, quote, withdrawn from access. You can't interact directly with them, they can't interact directly with you, neither can the termites interact directly with the wood, nor the wood with the termites, nor the termites and the wood with themselves. And yet, both the termites and the wood were altered by their meeting. This is possible because for O, causality is indirect. Reality is elsewhere. This introduces a problem, and this is usually the problem that causes people to give up on philosophy entirely. Things clearly happen, even if we can't fully know how they happen. The aesthetic dimension, Mourton's version of Harman's sensual realm, accounts for the how of happening. It provides a way to understand that objects interact with one another and with themselves at a distance. This is not to say that our termite-induced structural failure didn't happen, but rather, paradoxically, that it happened without direct contact between the respective realities of the termites, the wood, and us, who must now deal with the shattered structural member in our kitchen. In other words, Mourton's aesthetic dimension demonstrates that interactions between objects are profoundly weird. There's more going on in them than we can possibly know, and most of it happens beyond the sphere of our consciousness. However interesting it may be, possessing a philosophically sound account of causality is not normally a concern as we stretch an actual tarp over an actual hole in our termite-ridden roof. This makes philosophy very easy to ignore, and most of the time, most of us do so quite happily. This is too bad, for philosophy opens an invaluable window onto the more mysterious aspects of our world. No, keep going. All right. Tell me if that stops again. Think back to the day you decided to buy that house. As you walked into the light-bathed kitchen, its exposed beams drawing your eyes through glass walls to a lush garden beyond, something hit you. You love this place. What hit you? Certainly it wasn't the house. Most of your contact with the house was incidental. Its surfaces directed photons toward your eyes, your weight caused its floors to deflect imperceptibly, etc. But for the most part, the house just sat there, unperturbed by your presence, and physically you were scarcely impacted by it. Yet somehow it had a profound effect on you. In fact, it was the house that hit you, but it did so without physically hitting you. It affected you at a distance. That is, it affected you aesthetically. O helps us to see that the world often operates more like art than like machinery. There is more to causality than direct sensual contact, as when a piston turns a crank or a termite eats a beam. Causality among real objects is indirect and extremely weird, as when a termite eats a beam or a work of architecture moves you. Architectural aesthetic causality, the kind that counts for O, is causality without contact. By linking it so closely with causality, Mourton seems to move aesthetics away from its traditional associations with beauty. In fact, he doesn't move it that far. Causality was baked into Immanuel Kant's famous characterization of a beautiful object as involving purposiveness without purpose, just as it was in Horatio Greenough's definition of beauty as the promise of function. Notice in both cases that the cause of beauty, its purpose, is displaced in place and time. Kant relegates purpose to the ambiguous elsewhere. Purpose is absent, while Greenough puts it off until later. Function is in the future. So for this, you can read The Critique of Judgment by Kant, or Greenough's Relative and Independent Beauty, or again, you could take my word for it. I recommend the latter. Those are long and dense. In any event, consider Mourton's take on the causal ambiguities of beauty. The basic issue with beauty is that it is ungraspable. I can't point directly to it, and I can't decide whether it's me or the thing that is emanating the beauty. Things influence one another such that they become entangled and smear together. So, as with those billions of car ignitions, a weird looping structure undoes straightforward mechanical causality and calls into question the status of subjects and objects. For Mourton, these loops and the flattened hierarchies that result from them demand a wholesale reconsideration of philosophy, politics, and art. Through them, he aims to articulate, as opposed to camouflage, our paradoxical status as both perpetrators and victims of ecological crimes, and to chart an alternative future through what he calls econiosis, his neologism for a fuller, more honest, and even joyous knowing of our place in and as the world. Dark ecology presents a daring alternative to mainstream ecological thinking. The intellectual investment, however, is substantial. For architects, it involves extended sojourns into territory beyond even the most ambitiously drawn disciplinary boundaries. Many won't be willing to make the trip. Fortunately, uncanny premonitions of Mourton's ideas exist comfortably within the architectural ken in Reyner Banham's late career writing on the American desert. In these little discussed texts, Banham set out to make sense of the fascination, exhilaration, and befuddlement he felt in the Mojave and other western deserts. His is not the pristine, empty desert of popular imagination, but rather a man-mauled landscape, literally shot through with evidence of human activity. It's crisscrossed by freeways and power lines, pockmarked by rusted-out cars and deserted campsites, and punctuated by odd oases like Baker, Zzyzx, and Las Vegas. All this adds to the desert's poetry, and some objects, like the McMath Pierce Solar Telescope in Arizona, exude a stunning sense of rightness and conviction. Banham's experience is far removed from Frank Lloyd Wright's romantic quip that the desert represents where God is and man is not. The term desert, Banham reminds us, is rooted in desertion and abandonment. As human activity is integral to Mourton's understandings of ecology, for Banham, people precede the desert. And like Mourton's ecology, Banham's desert is deeply weird. Each chapter in Scenes in America Deserta, which he wrote in 1982, begins with a revelation provoked by the desert's alien qualities. These range from strange atmospheric effects. It was uncanny, as if the laws of nature had been suspended, to the appropriateness of the unusual. Only the exotic or the outrageous in architecture tends to look at home. to personal feelings of incongruity. I kept my head down and wondered if I seemed equally weird. At Mesa Verde and other inscrutable ancient sites, Banham feels alienated, as if he has come up against a glass wall through which seeing was possible, but comprehension was not. Yet, with its alien forms, uncanny colors, and ethereal light, Banham finds the desert to be profoundly beautiful. Here again, we find an eerie parallel with Morton. For Morton, the joys of echinosis is akin to the experience of the immersive colored light in the James Turrell installation, in which, as Morton describes, the environment at its purest seems to absorb me from all sides. Banham finds a similar ecstatic dissolution outside of Las Vegas. And here's Banham. The towers of lights and the changing sky signs were wavering dizzily and fractured into flickering filaments and ripples of pink and electric blue and gold, floating above a reflecting pool of mirage in the purple air. The effect was like a dream city dissolving in its own ecstasy. You don't find that kind of writing in architectural history all that often. You kind of wish you did. Now, like Morton, Banham finds traditional aesthetic terminology inadequate to understand such beauty. The desert, he observes, is not strictly beautiful in the technical sense of the term. Go on in. As employed by 18th century philosophers of aesthetics. Nor was Plato's discourse on beauty, so good on solids, disappointing on color, and dull on light, up to the task. Rather, in a distinct premonition of one of Morton's favorite phrases, Banham finally admits that the desert just is beautiful. Right at the end now. Even so, the desert's beauty appears to have to do with a Kantian sense of displaced causality. Something in my long-term uneasiness and fascination with the desert, Banham writes, derives from my never having found a suitable disguise or function with which to designate my relationship to the landscape I love. This insight leads Banham to reassess his own subjectivity. The desert, he says, has made me ask questions about myself that I would never otherwise have asked. And since I have no convincing answers to these questions, I have not done what one is supposed to do in the desert ever since the time of Moses. I have not found myself. If anything, I've lost myself in the sense that I now feel that I understand myself less than before. What I've truly found, however, is something that I value in some ways more than myself. Thus, Banham arrives at a place Morton would discover 3 decades later, a place where we humans might learn to shed at least some of the persistent anthropocentrism we've inherited, to relinquish our claim to stand at the center of the universe, and to face up to the role we've played in making and unmaking the world around us. Whether we trace the twisting braids of Morton's dark ecology or set out along more scenic routes in the desert with Banham, we will discover an environment bereft of its mythological trappings and stripped bare of its supposedly natural purity. This is a landscape stained and trampled, franchised and fenced, burned, flooded, grazed, mined, exploited, and laid waste. This place is weird, alien, and uncanny, coiled into strange loops by persistent ironies and paradox. We need to learn to live with situations like this, Banham reminds us, to take pleasure and reward from the good we can extract from the results of our actions, as well as responsibility for our often unforeseen consequences. So, we end with this: pleasure and responsibility. In place of the stark contrast, or the stark choice between apparently extraneous form and supposedly productive function with which we began, a last strange loop. This one between an end effect of beauty and a root cause of justice. Linked through language and shared affinities to the word fair, the two concepts are analogous. Beauty motivates the slackening of self-interest from which justice springs. It should come as no surprise that aesthetics would figure so strongly in projecting viable futures in the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.